A reading from Matthew chapter 14, verses 13 to 21. Jesus feeds the 5,000. When Jesus heard what had happened, he withdrew by boat privately to a solitary place. Hearing of this, the crowds followed him on foot from the towns. When Jesus landed and saw a large crowd, he had compassion on them and healed their sick. As evening approached, the disciples came to him and said, "This is a remote place and it's already getting late. Send the crowds away so that they can go to the villages and buy themselves some food." Jesus replied, "They do not need to go away. You give them something to eat." "We have here only 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish," they answered. "Bring them here to me," he said. And he directed the people to sit down on the grass. Taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven, he gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples, and the disciples gave them to the people. They all ate and were satisfied, and the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces that were left over. The number of those who ate was about 5,000 men, besides women and children.
Today's Gospel is a very familiar one. It's in all 4 of the Gospel readings. It's the story of Jesus feeding the 5,000. But Matthew, and it's Matthew's Gospel we read today, has something particularly interesting. He tells us the context. And the context was that Jesus had just heard about the death of John the Baptist, who was beheaded at the hands of King Herod. And so he goes out into the wilderness to find space with God and silence, to be on his own with his disciples. And yet as they crossed the lake with the boat, other people would have seen them in great numbers. And so by the time he arrives at the far shore, there's already a great crowd of people. And what does Jesus do? In all the Gospels it says that he has compassion on them. His heart is moved by their needs, and we read that he teaches them and he heals them and he cares for them. And so we come to the end of the day, and the disciples say to Jesus, "Now send the crowd away." And that was a very kind, a very thoughtful thing to say. They were thinking about Jesus, who was exhausted, who was filled with grief for his cousin, for his colleague, John the Baptist. But also they were thinking about the crowds, and they say the day has nearly gone, that the crowds are hungry. They've come a long way. They're hungry and they're tired. And of course there were children, as we know, among them as well. Surely this is time to send the crowds home. And then Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, "You feed them." And we read that the disciples bring forward 2 loaves, so 5 loaves and 2 fish. Enough just about for 2 people, but not nearly enough for 5,000 people. But they bring what they have, they bring it to Jesus. He blesses it, he prays to God, and then he gives it back to them, and that's very important. We'll never know quite what happened. None of us will quite understand how the miracle happened. But there was a miracle that day, that as the disciples went out, they were able to feed all the crowd that were there that day. But this isn't just a story about something that happened beside Galilee, by the lake, 2,000 years ago. This is a story for us today. And the meaning of that story is that when we offer to God our food, our bread, our fish, our hands, our feet, our gifts, our ideas, our talents, our enthusiasm, when we bring our artistic skills or our musical skills, when we bring the skills that we have with hand and with eye, when we offer them to God, he's able to bless them and to multiply them. And certainly I think lots of us have seen that happening during this pandemic. Food banks are often supported, sometimes hosted or sometimes led by churches. And the needs have been great. At times the needs have been overwhelming as families have come, and we've sought where we could to respond to that. And in our schools, people have given of their time so generously to make sure that children, particularly children from our more deprived and needy families, receive not only the education, but also the care, the support, and yes, even the food that they need. So we've been seeing that as we as churches, as Christians, have been going out into our streets and our communities, our villages and our towns in order to bring help and comfort, healing and hope to those who we seek to serve. Tucked away in Paul's letter to the Ephesians is this wonderful words of Paul. He says that God is able to do far more than all we can ask or imagine. And how is that? It's because of his power working in us, working for the glory of God. And so today's gospel reminds us to be continually hopeful, to be continually generous, to be continually grateful, and to offer to God those gifts and talents, those money, those resources, the time that we have. Ask him to bless it and to multiply it. He gives it back to us. It is sometimes said that the church is the body, the hands and the feet of Christ today. Certainly, we go out in the name of Christ to share God's love, and so that others will find help and hope in these needy and difficult times. May God bless us as we seek to serve, love and care for others. Amen.